Have you ever reached a point where your life still looks the same from the outside, but inside it already feels over? The habits are still there. The routines are still there. The distractions still know how to find you. But something in you has started rejecting all of it. Not loudly, quietly, deeply. Like a part of your soul has become tired of helping the wrong version of you survive. That is where real change begins. Not when you feel inspired, not when you make another promise, but when the life you keep repeating starts to feel false in your own hands. Because the old you does not only live in your past, it lives in what you still tolerate, in the excuses you still make at night, in the patterns you still protect, even while saying you want a different life. And there comes a moment when self-improvement is no longer enough. Something in you realizes that this is not about adding more motivation. It is about ending what should no longer be allowed to lead you. This episode is about that kind of ending, the kind that happens in solitude, the kind that demands discipline, the kind that becomes real when going back is no longer an option. Cut off the life that keeps recreating the same you. You cannot become someone new while protecting the environment that keeps rebuilding the old version of you every day. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, because the old self is not held together by one dramatic flaw. It is held together by familiar things, familiar habits, familiar people, familiar comforts, familiar escapes. The music of your old life keeps playing through the same daily patterns, and then you wonder why the same identity keeps returning. But identity is not built by intention alone, it is built by exposure. By what surrounds you often enough to shape your mind without asking for permission. This is why real change feels more like separation than improvement. At a certain point, you do not need another motivational speech. You do not need a new planner, a better quote, or one more promise to yourself at midnight. You need distance from what keeps producing the same results in you. Because if your inputs stay the same, your reactions stay the same. If your routines stay the same, your thinking stays the same. If your attention keeps feeding the same patterns, then the old you never really dies. It only goes quiet for a few days, then returns the moment life becomes uncomfortable again. A lot of people say they want transformation, but they are still sleeping inside the structure that created their weakness. They still wake up to the same noise. They still give their mornings to the same distractions. They still spend time with people who reinforce the same smallness, the same confusion, the same emotional habits. They still keep the same private rituals of avoidance when no one is watching. And then they ask why discipline does not last. But discipline struggles to survive in an atmosphere designed for self-betrayal. That is why the first step is not to fight yourself harder. It is to cut off the conditions that keep recreating the version of you that you say you want to leave behind. Sometimes that means changing your environment. Sometimes it means changing what enters your mind. Sometimes it means stepping back from people who keep inviting you into your lower nature. The part of you that wants ease without growth, pleasure without cost, comfort without truth. Not everyone around you is destroying you in an obvious way. Some simply keep you the same. And sameness becomes dangerous when your soul is trying to outgrow the life it has been trapped inside. The Stoics understood this well. They knew that character is shaped by practice, repetition, and influence. You do not become strong by admiring strength. You become strong by removing what makes weakness easy and making discipline the more natural path. That is why Marcus Aurelius kept returning to the need for inner command. He knew the mind becomes stained by what it keeps entertaining. So if you are serious about rebuilding yourself, you have to ask a harder question than, what do I want to become? You have to ask, what in my current life keeps rebuilding the person I am trying to escape? Sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. It may be your phone, your late-night habits, the endless stimulation that keeps your mind too crowded to hear itself. It may be the people you laugh with but become smaller around. It may be the routines that feel harmless because they are common but quietly keep your standards low. It may even be the stories you revisit, the places you return to, the emotional patterns you still feed because they are familiar even though they are costing you your future. And this is where the rebuild becomes real, not when you feel inspired, but when you begin cutting ties with what keeps reproducing your old identity, calmly, clearly, without drama. You stop calling certain things normal just because they have been present for a long time. You stop giving permanent access to what weakens your focus, your discipline, your self-respect. You stop arranging your life around the comfort of a self you already know is too small for where you need to go. Because the truth is simple. The old you does not survive only through memory. It survives through structure, through repeated contact, through constant exposure. And once you understand that, change stops being mysterious. You do not need to become a different person in one grand moment. You need to stop living inside the machine that keeps manufacturing the old one. That is the first cut, and without it, nothing else holds for long. Stop negotiating with your weaker self. The old version of you rarely survives through huge decisions. It survives through quiet negotiations, through the little conversations you have with yourself when no one is watching, the ones that sound harmless in the moment. I'll start tomorrow. One more night will not matter. I deserve a break. I'm too tired today. I'll be stricter next week. None of these sentences feel destructive when they appear. That is exactly why they are so dangerous. They do not attack your life directly. They slowly loosen your standards until self-betrayal starts feeling reasonable. This is how the weaker self protects its place, not through force, but through persuasion. It knows you are no longer fully satisfied with who you have been, so it does not try to defend the whole structure at once. It simply asks for one more compromise, one more delay, one more exception, one more private permission to remain the same. And if you keep accepting these negotiations, the old you never has to fight for survival. You keep feeding it yourself. A lot of people imagine transformation as a battle against pain, difficulty, or external resistance. But often the real battle is much quieter than that. It happens in ordinary moments when comfort speaks with a reasonable voice, when the bed feels warmer than discipline, when distraction feels easier than reflection, when the mind starts offering explanations that sound gentle, intelligent, even compassionate, but lead to the same result. No change, no movement, no separation from the self you said you wanted to leave behind. This is why rebuilding yourself requires a form of honesty that many people avoid. You have to stop calling weakness by softer names, because not every act of self-kindness is kindness. Sometimes it is just avoidance with a more beautiful label. Sometimes what you call rest is escape. Sometimes what you call patience is fear of beginning. Sometimes what you call being realistic is just loyalty to a smaller life. The Stoic mind is useful here because it keeps bringing everything back to truth. Not the truth that flatters you, the truth that exposes you, the truth that asks, what is this decision really serving? Is it helping you build a stronger life, or is it protecting the habits that keep you fragmented? Your weaker self does not need much to survive. It only needs your permission, repeated often enough. That is why discipline is not mainly about intensity. It is about ending the private loopholes through which the old identity keeps returning. The moment you decide that your excuses no longer get a vote, something begins to change, not because life becomes easier, but because the inner discussion becomes shorter, clearer, cleaner. You stop standing in the doorway debating with the version of you that wants comfort without cost. You stop treating every standard like a suggestion. You decide, and then you obey the decision. That sounds simple, but it changes everything, because much of suffering comes from living in internal contradiction. One part of you wants growth. Another part keeps negotiating with decay. One part wants discipline. Another keeps asking for exceptions. One part is tired of the old life. Another still wants to preserve its pleasures, its habits, its emotional escapes. That split drains enormous energy. It keeps you mentally tired before the real work even begins. But when you stop negotiating, you reclaim that energy. You no longer waste it deciding again and again whether you will respect your own standard. The standard is already set. Your task is to follow it. This does not mean becoming cruel with yourself. It means becoming clear. Clear that your future cannot be built by bargaining with the same impulses that weakened your past. Clear that every time you say yes to the lower pattern, you strengthen it. Clear that your life will not rise above the level of the compromises you keep making in secret. Seneca warned often about the danger of self-deception, and this is one of its most common forms. Knowing exactly what is ruining your peace, then continuing to entertain it because the cost arrives slowly. So there comes a point where you must become very quiet and very firm. No more discussion with the habit. No more emotional speeches before doing what already needs to be done. No more making your higher life ask permission from your weaker moods. The old you survives through negotiation. The new you begins the moment that negotiation ends. Use solitude to see yourself clearly. One of the reasons the old self survives for so long is that noise keeps protecting it. Constant interaction, constant input, constant stimulation, constant movement from one thing to the next. When your mind is always occupied, you can avoid seeing what is really happening inside you. You can stay busy enough not to notice your patterns, entertained enough not to question your habits, distracted enough not to face the gap between the life you say you want and the life you are actually feeding. That is why solitude matters so much. Not because being alone is automatically noble, but because silence removes many of the places where self-deception likes to hide. When you step away from noise, something uncomfortable happens at first. You begin meeting yourself without interruption. No quick escape into your phone. No social energy to blur your thoughts. No outside voices to tell you who you are for the day. It is just you, your mind, your habits, your unrest, your unfinished thoughts, your impulses, your fears. And that meeting can feel heavy in the beginning, because many people do not actually fear being alone. They fear what becomes visible when they are alone. They fear the truth that rises when distraction is no longer available to keep it buried. This is why solitude is not passive. It is revealing. It shows you where your peace really is and where it is only being borrowed from stimulation. It shows you what thoughts keep returning when there is nothing to drown them out. It shows you whether your identity has substance or whether it has been held together by activity, approval, and constant contact. A lot of people feel strong when they are surrounded, admired, occupied, or validated. But take away the noise, and they meet a self they do not fully trust yet. That is not failure. That is information. And information like that is priceless if you are serious about rebuilding. The Stoics understood that a person cannot govern what they refuse to observe. Before discipline becomes stable, the inner world must become visible. You need to see how your mind moves when nobody is around to influence it. You need to notice what you reach for when boredom arrives. You need to hear the private language of your cravings, your excuses, your loneliness, your vanity, your sadness, your hunger for escape. Solitude gives you that chance. It places your inner life in front of you without decoration. And that kind of clarity can feel humbling, but it is also where rebuilding becomes honest. Because once you can see yourself clearly, you stop speaking in vague terms. You stop saying, "I just need to do better," and begin noticing what actually breaks you down. You see the emotional habits you call personality. You see the restless need for attention that disguises itself as connection. You see the avoidance patterns that keep wearing the clothes of comfort. You see how often you look outward because inward still feels unfamiliar. Solitude brings those things into the light, not to shame you, but to make change possible. There is also a quieter gift inside being alone. You begin discovering what is real in you beneath performance. What do you value when no one is watching? What kind of standards do you keep when there is no praise attached to them? What thoughts arise when you are not busy managing how you appear? That is where self-respect starts becoming real. Not in public declarations, but in private alignment, in the ability to sit with yourself without immediately reaching for escape, in the discipline to remain present long enough for truth to emerge. At first, solitude may feel empty because you're used to being filled by noise. Stay there a little longer. Beneath that first layer of discomfort, something steadier begins to form. Your thoughts slow down. Your inner life becomes less crowded. You begin hearing the difference between what you actually want and what you were simply conditioned to chase. And from that place, rebuilding becomes less dramatic and more precise. You are no longer just trying to change your life. You are learning how to see it without distortion. That is why solitude is necessary. The old self thrives in distraction. The new self begins in honest silence. When you can be alone without escaping yourself, you are no longer being carried by noise. You are finally starting to stand. Identify the habits that keep the old you alive. The old version of you does not live only in your thoughts. It lives in your behavior, in the small, repeated actions that seem ordinary enough to escape your attention. The way you sleep too late and wake up already behind. The way you eat without awareness when you feel empty, stressed, or restless. The way you reach for your phone the moment silence appears. The way you delay difficult work, avoid difficult feelings, and then wonder why your life keeps feeling heavy. Identity is not held together by what you say about yourself once in a while. It is held together by what you repeat often enough that it starts feeling normal. That is why change stays weak until you become honest about your habits, not the dramatic ones only, the quiet ones, the ones you excuse because they are common, the ones that live in the private corners of your day. The 10 wasted minutes that become an hour. The late night that ruins the next morning. The constant scrolling that keeps your mind overstimulated and spiritually dull. The impulse to escape discomfort before you have even learned anything from it. These things may not look like the reason your life feels stuck, but many times they are exactly the reason. Because the old you survives through repetition. It survives through rituals that keep your standards low and your awareness foggy. A lot of people want a new life while protecting the daily behavior that makes the old life inevitable. They want clarity, but they keep feeding confusion. They want discipline, but they keep rewarding impulse. They want self-respect, but they keep practicing private choices that quietly weaken it. And that is the painful part. A person can speak beautifully about growth and still spend most of their day rehearsing the same identity they claim they want to leave behind. The Stoics would bring this back to one simple truth. Character is trained, not announced, not imagined, trained. What you do repeatedly becomes what you can do naturally, and what you tolerate repeatedly becomes what starts shaping you. So if you are serious about rebuilding, you have to look at your habits without romance, without excuses, without saying, "This is just who I am." No. Much of what you call personality is often just repetition with emotional attachment. It is not that you are naturally distracted. You have trained distraction. It is not that you are naturally weak with discomfort. You have practiced escape. It is not that you lack discipline as a person. You have simply obeyed habits that make indiscipline easier than self-command. That should not fill you with shame. It should fill you with responsibility because what has been practiced can also be replaced. Begin there. Look at the actual structure of your day. What do you do when you wake up? What do you reach for when you feel pressure? What do you consume when you are bored? What do you avoid when something matters? What steals your attention again and again? What weakens your body, your focus, your emotional steadiness? These are not small questions. They are the map of the self you are currently feeding. And if you do not study that map, you will keep attacking the surface while the deeper pattern remains untouched. Rebuilding starts becoming real when you stop speaking about your future in abstract terms and start confronting the behaviors that are quietly deciding it. The habit of overthinking, the habit of delay, the habit of numbing yourself with noise, the habit of saying you will begin later, the habit of living in reaction instead of intention. Each one is like a hidden rope tying you to the old life. And if you leave those ropes untouched, the old identity will keep returning no matter how motivated you feel for a few days. This is why awareness is powerful. Once you clearly see the habits that keep the old you alive, they stop looking innocent. You begin noticing them in real time. You catch the moment before the escape. You see the pattern before it fully takes over. And that moment matters because it is the place where self-respect begins to return. Not in one grand victory, but in the quiet interruption of what used to own you. That is how the old self starts losing power. First, it is exposed. Then, it is weakened. Then, little by little, it stops being fed. Destroy the beliefs that keep you small. Long before a person changes their life, they have to confront something deeper than habit. They have to confront belief. Because the old you is not only kept alive by what you do, it is also kept alive by what you quietly accept as true. The private story you repeat about yourself, the hidden limits you stopped questioning years ago, the assumptions that now move through your mind so automatically that they no longer even sound like beliefs. They sound like facts. This is just how I am. I always fall back. I am not disciplined enough. I am too late to become different. Other people can transform, but not me. These sentences may look harmless because they're familiar, but they're not harmless at all. They become the invisible walls of your life. This is why some people change their routine for a week, their schedule for a month, even their whole environment for a season, and still return to the same identity. The structure around them improved, but the belief underneath it did not die. And when the deeper belief remains untouched, it keeps pulling the person back toward the same emotional level, the same standards, the same self-image. A human being will often fight very hard to protect an identity they claim they hate, simply because it is familiar. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. Familiar weakness feels easier than the responsibility of becoming someone new. The Stoics understood that judgment shapes experience. It is not only events that govern a life, but the meaning the mind attaches to those events. If you believe you are weak, every difficult day becomes proof. If you believe you are broken, every setback becomes a confirmation. If you believe your past has already decided your future, then every failure feels final and every effort feels temporary. In that state, you do not just suffer from life. You suffer from the story through which you interpret life. And many people do not realize that the voice limiting them is not truth. It is repetition, a repeated interpretation, a repeated conclusion, a repeated act of obedience to an old self that no longer deserves authority. This is where rebuilding becomes more serious. You are no longer just replacing bad behavior. You are interrogating the belief system that made that behavior feel natural. Why do you keep lowering your standard the moment things become difficult? Why do you return to distractions the moment silence appears? Why do you keep delaying the life you claim to want? Beneath every repeated pattern, there is usually a belief protecting it. Maybe you still believe discipline will make life joyless. Maybe you still believe comfort is safety. Maybe you still believe that because you failed before, you cannot be trusted now. Maybe you still believe you need the approval of others before your new identity is real. These beliefs are rarely loud, but they quietly rule everything. And this is why they must be destroyed, not politely managed. Some beliefs do not need better wording. They need an ending. Because as long as you keep obeying the same inner script, the old life will keep rebuilding itself around it. You cannot rise into a different way of living while kneeling before the same ideas that kept you small. At some point, you have to become ruthless with falsehood. You have to hear the old sentence in your mind and refuse to let it pass as wisdom anymore. You have to stop treating every old fear like a prophecy. The thought appears, yes, but now you see it for what it is. Not identity, not truth, not destiny. Just an old voice trying to survive. This does not mean pretending to be limitless in some shallow way. It means becoming honest enough to separate fact from inheritance, truth from conditioning, reality from self-protection. Maybe your life has been difficult. Maybe your history did wound you. Maybe your confidence was broken in places that still ache. But pain is not authority. A wound may explain why you became smaller, but it does not get to decide how long you remain there. Rebuilding requires that you stop building your future around conclusions drawn by your weakest seasons. A stronger life begins when your inner language changes, not into fantasy, into responsibility. I can be trained. I can become steadier. I do not need to obey every old thought. My past may have shaped me, but it does not own me. Those are not motivational slogans. They are acts of mental separation. They break the alliance between your future and the beliefs that kept your old identity alive. Because in the end, the life you build will rise or fall to the level of what you believe is possible for you. If the old beliefs remain, they will keep calling you back into the same small room, even after the door has opened. But when those beliefs begin to die, something powerful happens. The old self loses its logic. It loses the story that defended it. And once that happens, change no longer feels like betrayal of who you are. It starts feeling like the first honest thing you have done in a very long time. Set a standard that your old life cannot survive. Rebuilding yourself does not begin the day you feel more motivated. It begins the day you become less available for what keeps degrading you. That is what a real standard is. Not a mood, not a temporary burst of discipline, not a dramatic speech you give yourself after a painful night. A standard is a line that changes what is allowed to live inside your days. It decides what gets access to your body, your mind, your time, your habits, your attention. And once that line becomes real, the old life starts losing oxygen. A lot of people say they want change, but their standards are still too low to make change inevitable. They still tolerate the same sleep patterns that leave them mentally weak. They still tolerate the same distractions that break their focus. They still tolerate the same emotional habits that make them reactive, scattered, and easy to pull off course. They still tolerate the same private behavior that slowly destroys self-respect. Then they wonder why nothing holds. But life always falls to the level of what you permit. If the old patterns are still allowed to stay, the old self will stay with them. This is why standards matter more than motivation. Motivation rises and falls. Standards decide what happens when motivation disappears. A person with low standards needs to feel ready before they act. A person with real standards acts because certain things are no longer negotiable. That difference changes everything. Once something becomes non-negotiable, it stops draining mental energy. You no longer sit there every day debating whether you will protect your sleep, your focus, your word, your routine, your peace. The decision has already been made. The standard has spoken before your weaker mood gets a chance. The Stoics understood this at the deepest level. They knew that a person becomes stable not by chasing inspiration, but by organizing life around principles that are stronger than emotion. What you repeatedly allow becomes part of your character. What you repeatedly reject becomes part of your freedom. So if you are serious about destroying the old you, you have to stop asking what feels comfortable and start asking what your new life requires. What can no longer be tolerated if you actually mean what you say? What habits must lose access? What environments must stop being normal? What type of self-talk, emotional indulgence, lateness, laziness, chaos, and avoidance must now be treated as unacceptable? That question is uncomfortable because it forces you to see how often your suffering is not only caused by what happens to you, but by what you keep allowing after you already know better. There is a point where ignorance ends and tolerance begins. You already know which habits weaken your body. You already know what steals your attention. You already know what ruins your mornings, destabilizes your mind, and makes your discipline fragile. So the rebuild deepens the moment you stop acting like these things are still harmless. They are not harmless anymore. They are now in direct conflict with the person you are trying to become. A strong standard changes your relationship with yourself. You stop seeing discipline as punishment and start seeing it as protection. You stop treating boundaries with yourself like cruelty and start recognizing them as structure. You begin to understand that freedom is not found in endless options. It is found in clear refusal. Refusal to keep feeding what lowers you. Refusal to keep living in ways that make your future smaller. Refusal to keep betraying your own clarity just because the old life still feels familiar. And the truth is, your old life cannot survive high standards for long. It cannot survive a mind that no longer tolerates chaos. It cannot survive a body that is treated with respect. It cannot survive days that are given shape, attention, and order. It cannot survive when you stop calling your weakness personality and start confronting it as a pattern that must end. The old self depends on looseness, loopholes, emotional indulgence, and lack of consequence. Remove those and something in you starts changing whether you feel dramatic about it or not. This is why the rebuild becomes real here, when you quietly decide that some things are over, not because you hate yourself, but because you finally respect yourself enough to stop living beneath what you already know. A person changes when their standards become too strong for their old habits to keep surviving inside them. And from that point on, every clean decision becomes a form of separation. Every kept promise becomes proof. Every refusal becomes a piece of the new structure. You do not need a perfect life to begin. You need a line, a serious one, a line your old life keeps crashing into. Because once your standards become clear enough, your old self no longer dies through emotion. It dies through lack of permission. Stop feeding the identity you say you want to kill. There is a painful contradiction that keeps many people trapped for years. They say they want a different life, but every day they keep rewarding the same identity that is ruining the one they have. They feed it with attention. They feed it with excuses. They feed it with emotional indulgence. They feed it with habits they already know are destructive. Then wonder why the old self still feels so alive. But the truth is simple. An identity does not survive because it is strong. It survives because it is fed. This is why change becomes impossible when your private behavior keeps protecting what your public words claim to reject. You say you want discipline, but you keep rewarding avoidance. You say you want peace, but you keep returning to stimulation, drama, and mental noise. You say you want self-respect, but you keep choosing the same impulses that leave you feeling weak afterward. That split is exhausting. Not only because it slows progress, but because it creates an inner life built on dishonesty. A part of you knows what must end, yet another part keeps making sure it stays comfortable enough to survive. The old you does not ask for much. It only asks to be indulged one more time, one more escape, one more exception, one more emotional reaction, one more evening wasted, one more story that justifies staying the same. And because the cost is rarely immediate, it is easy to keep saying yes. That is how the old identity remains in power. Not because it deserves to lead, but because it is still being treated like a guest you cannot stop serving. Every time you protect the impulse, soften the consequence, or romanticize the weakness, you send a message to yourself. This version of me still has a home here. The Stoics were clear about this. A person becomes what they repeatedly practice, but they also become what they repeatedly permit. If you keep giving energy to resentment, resentment becomes easier. If you keep feeding distraction, silence becomes harder. If you keep rewarding the part of you that wants comfort without discipline, that part will keep speaking with authority. This is why rebuilding yourself is not only about adding new habits, it is also about starving old patterns. Some identities do not need more reflection, they need less food. That can sound severe, but it is actually very practical. Look closely at what still receives your energy. What thoughts do you keep entertaining even though they weaken you? What moods do you keep obeying even though they never lead anywhere good? What pleasures do you keep protecting, even though they leave you emptier every time? What kind of self-talk do you keep repeating, even though it keeps the old story alive? These are not small details. They are the supply lines of the person you are trying to outgrow. If the supply remains open, the structure remains standing. Many people wait to feel ready before they stop feeding the old self. But readiness is often a luxury created by delay. You do not become ready by continuing the same behavior. You become ready by cutting its nourishment, by making the wrong thing harder to reach, by making the old pattern less convenient, by refusing to keep comforting what should be dying. This is where discipline becomes deeper than motivation. It is not just doing what is right once. It is refusing to keep financing what is wrong. And there is something else here that matters. Some people do not let go of the old identity because beneath all the frustration, they are still emotionally attached to parts of it. The old pain feels familiar. The old chaos gives them stimulation. The old weakness gives them an excuse. The old story protects them from the risk of fully becoming someone new. That is why starving the old self can feel like grief. You are not only losing bad habits, you are losing an old way of relating to yourself, an old emotional home. Even if that home was damaging, it was known. And leaving what is known always asks something of you. But this is the threshold, the place where rebuilding becomes real. The day you stop acting like the old identity deserves comfort on its way out. The day you stop rewarding the impulses you claim to hate. The day you stop feeding the pattern and then calling yourself confused about why it remains strong. From there, change becomes less dramatic and more honest. You do not need to declare war every morning. You simply stop giving your energy to what is trying to keep you small. Because in the end, the old you cannot survive without your cooperation. That is the hard truth, but also the freeing one. If you stop feeding it, it weakens. If you stop protecting it, it loses ground. If you stop obeying it, it begins to die. And once you truly understand that, your life changes. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for the new self to finally have space to breathe. Build a routine that makes the new you inevitable. A person does not become new because they felt intense for 3 days. They become new because their life was structured in a way that stopped giving the old self so many chances to return. That is what routine really is when it is understood properly. It is not restriction for the sake of control. It is not punishment. It is not a rigid performance of discipline designed to impress anyone. It is the quiet architecture of a different identity. It is the decision to stop leaving your future at the mercy of mood, impulse, and whatever version of you happens to wake up that day. This matters more than people think, because many lives stay stuck not from lack of desire, but from lack of structure. A person wants to change, and maybe they mean it sincerely. They read, reflect, promise, plan, even suffer enough to know something has to end. But if their days remain unshaped, the old self keeps finding empty space to move through. It slips into the morning when there is no clear start. It slips into the afternoon when attention has nowhere to go. It slips into the evening when fatigue arrives and there is no system strong enough to carry the body and mind through the weaker hours. This is why good intentions are not enough. Without structure, intention keeps dissolving into repetition. The Stoics understood that a life becomes stable when action is tied to principle, not emotion. You do not wait to feel disciplined before you live with order. You live with order, so discipline becomes less dependent on feeling. That is the shift. A routine is not there to make life heavy. It is there to remove unnecessary decisions, to reduce the amount of inner debate, to keep you from having to reinvent your standards every morning. When the structure is clear, your energy stops leaking into constant negotiation. You already know when you wake, how you begin, what your work block is, when you train, when you step away, when the day closes. This does not make you mechanical. It makes you reliable to yourself. And that reliability is what begins rebuilding self-trust. Because the new you is not formed by one heroic act. It is formed by repeated proof. Proof that you get up when you said you would. Proof that your morning is not instantly handed to distraction. Proof that your body is not treated like an afterthought. Proof that your attention has a home. Proof that your evenings are not open season for collapse. These things may sound simple, but identity is built exactly there, in the simple things repeated until they stop feeling optional. A lot of people resist routine because they are secretly still in love with freedom as impulse. They want change, but they also want to feel like they can do whatever they want, whenever they want. And that sounds appealing until you notice what it produces: inconsistency, self-doubt, scattered effort, and the constant humiliation of starting over. Real freedom is not the ability to obey every mood. Real freedom is living in such a way that your lower moods no longer have the power to keep rearranging your life. This is why your routine must be realistic enough to survive ordinary days, not just ideal days. It should not be built for the version of you that feels inspired, clear, and powerful. It should be built for the day you feel bored, heavy, restless, distracted, and not particularly impressive. That is the real test. Can your structure still hold when the emotion is gone? Can it carry you through the flat middle, the repetitive stretch, the hours when no dramatic transformation is visible? If it can, then you are no longer depending on intensity. You are building inevitability. And that is the goal, not to become a new person through one burst of force, but to live in a rhythm that slowly removes the old person's access to your life. A routine that makes the stronger self easier to become and the weaker self harder to obey. A routine that does not ask every day, "Will you do it?" but quietly answers, "This is how we live now." That is when rebuilding becomes real. When discipline is no longer a performance, when order stops feeling temporary. When the new you is not something you visit in rare moments of seriousness, but someone your daily structure keeps bringing into the room again and again until, one day, they are no longer new at all. Build the capacity to endure boredom and repetition. A lot of people do not fail because change is too hard. They fail because change becomes too repetitive before it becomes rewarding. At the beginning, rebuilding yourself can feel sharp, almost dramatic. There is energy in the decision. There is emotional force in saying, "I'm done with the old life." There is something almost powerful about the first clean morning, the first disciplined week, the first few days of saying no to what used to control you. But then comes the part that ruins most attempts at transformation. The middle, the quiet stretch where nothing feels cinematic. The days that look nearly the same. The effort that no longer feels exciting. The routine that starts feeling plain. And this is where many people turn back, not because they do not want a new life, but because they were secretly hoping the process would feel more alive than it really does. This is one of the least glamorous truths about becoming different. Much of it is boring, not empty, not meaningless, but repetitive in a way that the old self hates. The old self wants stimulation. It wants novelty, emotional spikes, visible progress, dramatic proof that something important is happening. It wants change to feel intense enough to keep the mind entertained. But real rebuilding is quieter than that. It often looks like doing the same right thing again before the reward arrives. Going to bed on time again, getting up again, training again, working again, saying no again, refusing distraction again, holding the line again. That kind of repetition does not flatter the ego. It does not give you a fresh identity every morning. It simply asks whether you are serious enough to keep going when the process stops feeling emotionally interesting. The Stoics would not be surprised by this. They understood that character is not built in moments of inspiration, but in repeated acts of alignment. The disciplined person is not someone who feels strong every day. It is someone who has stopped making boredom an argument against what matters. And that is a serious distinction, because many lives are quietly ruled by this belief. If it feels dull, maybe it is not right for me. But often the opposite is true. Sometimes what is saving your life feels dull precisely because it is not feeding your chaos anymore. It is not overstimulating you. It is not pulling you into emotional drama. It is not entertaining the restless part of you that wants every day to feel different in order to feel meaningful. That is why boredom must be retrained. You have to stop seeing it as a sign that nothing is happening. A boring day can be a very successful day. A repetitive week can be a very healing week. A simple routine, repeated with honesty, can rebuild a human being more deeply than 1,000 emotional breakthroughs. But to stay long enough for that truth to reveal itself, you need endurance. Not only endurance for pain, but endurance for monotony. Endurance for the plainness of practice. Endurance for the fact that many forms of growth feel ordinary while they are working. And this is where many people betray themselves without even noticing. They do not return to the old life because they truly believe in it. They return because it feels more stimulating. The old chaos has movement. The old habits have flavor. The old impulses have speed. There is always something happening there, even if it is destructive. By comparison, discipline can feel emotionally flat in the beginning, but flat is not dead. Flat may simply mean stable. It may mean you are no longer living off constant peaks and crashes. It may mean your nervous system is learning how to exist without being fed endless novelty. So part of rebuilding yourself is learning how to stay with simple things long enough for them to become sacred. The same morning walk, the same work block, the same quiet meal, the same training session, the same early night, the same refusal to go back to what weakens you. Not because repetition is exciting, but because repetition is how identity is carved into the body and mind. You do not become trustworthy to yourself by doing the right thing once, when emotion is high. You become trustworthy by doing it again when nothing in you is applauding. This is a deeper kind of maturity. The ability to continue without constant emotional reward. The ability to stay devoted to what is right, even when it feels plain. The ability to let the process be unglamorous without deciding it has lost value. Because the truth is, the new you is often being built on the most uneventful days. On the days no one sees. On the days that feel almost forgettable. on the days when the only victory is that you did not break the pattern. If you can endure that season, really endure it, something powerful begins to happen. The repetition stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like identity. The boring structure becomes peace. The ordinary discipline becomes self-respect. And the monotony that once made you restless starts becoming proof that your life is no longer being dragged around by impulse. That is when change becomes real. Not when it feels dramatic, but when you become steady enough to keep choosing it after the drama is gone. Learn to stand without praise, help, or permission. There is a stage in rebuilding yourself where effort is no longer the hardest part. The hardest part becomes this: continuing without being seen, without being reassured, without being told you are doing well, and without waiting for someone to emotionally carry you through the parts that still feel heavy. That is where many people discover how much of their discipline was still leaning on outside support. They can stay aligned when someone believes in them, when someone checks on them, when someone praises the progress, when someone reminds them of who they are trying to become. But the moment the encouragement disappears, something in them begins to wobble. Not because they are incapable of change, but because part of the old self is still dependent on being held from the outside. This dependence is subtler than most people think. It does not always look like weakness. Sometimes it looks like wanting just a little support, wanting confirmation that you are on the right path, wanting someone to notice how hard this is, wanting a voice that says, "Keep going, you are doing better than you think." And of course, there is nothing wrong with human warmth. There is nothing wrong with being helped, loved, supported, or encouraged. But if your alignment cannot survive the absence of those things, then your center is still not fully your own. Your direction is still partly rented from the world around you. The Stoic mind keeps returning to this question: what remains when applause is gone? What remains when nobody understands your process, nobody rewards your restraint, nobody notices your effort, and nobody comes to rescue you from your own excuses? That is the real measure, not because praise is evil, but because praise is unstable. Help is unstable. Reassurance is unstable. Permission is unstable. Some days it will be there, some days it will not. If your discipline depends on these things, then your progress will rise and fall with conditions you do not control. And the whole point of rebuilding yourself is to stop being ruled by what lies outside your command. A lot of people stay stuck because they are still waiting for the emotional atmosphere to feel right. They want certainty before commitment. They want support before action. They want someone to stand beside them so the path feels less lonely. But some parts of becoming stronger happen only when nobody is there to witness them. You wake up and do the work anyway. You keep the promise anyway. You endure the doubt anyway. You sit in the silence anyway. And through that, something deeper than motivation begins to form. You stop asking life to hold your hand through every transition. You begin learning how to carry yourself. This matters because the old self often survives through dependency disguised as sensitivity. It says, "I'll stay consistent when I feel encouraged. I'll be more disciplined when I have more support. I'll be stronger when someone finally understands me properly." But that way of thinking keeps power outside you. It turns praise into fuel, reassurance into structure, and emotional support into a condition for self-respect. The problem is not that these things feel good. The problem is that if they become necessary, then their absence becomes dangerous. You start collapsing not because the path is wrong, but because nobody clapped while you were walking it. There comes a point where you have to become your own witness, your own stabilizer, your own reminder. You have to know what you are doing and why you are doing it deeply enough that silence from others does not erase your direction. This is one of the most adult forms of inner strength, to continue without being chased, praised, admired, rescued, or emotionally carried. To not need people to constantly confirm that your pain is real, your effort matters, or your future is worth the price. That kind of self-possession changes everything because it makes your life less vulnerable to emotional weather. And there is something quietly liberating about it too. When you stop waiting for permission, you move sooner. When you stop waiting for praise, you move cleaner. When you stop depending on help to maintain your standards, your discipline becomes more private, more rooted, more real. You are no longer performing growth in the hope that someone will notice. You are building it because you have finally accepted that your life is your responsibility, even on the days when nobody comes close enough to help you carry it. That does not make you cold. It makes you grounded. You can still receive love. You can still appreciate support. You can still be grateful when encouragement arrives. But now those things are blessings, not foundations. Additions, not necessities. You are no longer owned by the presence or absence of someone else's voice. And once that happens, the rebuild becomes much more stable. Because the old self loses one of its favorite hiding places, the excuse that says, "I would become different if only someone helped me more." No, at a certain point, you either stand or you keep waiting, and the new life only begins for the person willing to stand, even when the room is quiet. Turn pain into discipline, not identity. Pain can wake a person up, but it can also trap them if they are not careful. That is the danger. A hard season can sharpen you, clarify you, strip away illusions, and force you to see what comfort kept hidden. But it can also become the center of your personality. It can become the main story you keep repeating to yourself and to others. The wound becomes your language. The betrayal becomes your lens. The disappointment becomes your explanation for everything. And when that happens, pain is no longer something you pass through. It becomes something you keep feeding until it starts replacing your future. This is one of the quiet reasons many people never fully rebuild. They do not only remember what hurt them, they begin living from it. They organize their identity around what happened, around who failed them, around what life took, around how deeply they were wounded. And to be clear, pain is real. Some wounds change a person. Some losses split life into a before and an after. Stoicism does not ask you to deny that. It asks for something harder and more honest. It asks whether your pain is becoming fuel for discipline or whether it is becoming a home you are afraid to leave because suffering has started to feel like proof that your story matters. That is where many people get stuck. Pain gives intensity. It gives emotional weight. It can even create a strange sense of identity. You know who you are when you are the one who was hurt, abandoned, misunderstood, broken, humiliated, overlooked. There is a kind of structure in that. A dark one, but still a structure. And this is why letting go of pain as identity can feel frightening. Not because healing is bad, but because healing removes an old center. It takes away a narrative you may have leaned on for years. Then the question becomes uncomfortable. If I am not the wounded version of me anymore, who am I? The answer cannot be found in more rumination. It has to be built in action. This is why pain must be turned into discipline, into standards, into restraint, into clearer choices, into deeper self-respect, into habits that honor what the suffering tried to teach you. Otherwise, pain becomes waste. Worse than waste, it becomes repetition. You keep reliving the same hurt without extracting any structure from it. You keep telling the story without allowing it to change the way you live. That keeps the wound emotionally alive long after the event itself has passed. The Stoics knew that suffering can either harden bitterness or deepen character, depending on what the mind does with it. If pain only makes you more resentful, more self-protective in the wrong ways, more attached to the role of the damaged self, then it is still ruling you. But if it teaches you how to choose better, how to endure better, how to speak less, see more, expect less, and respect yourself more clearly, then something sacred has happened. The pain did not define you. It refined you. That refinement is quiet. It may look like waking up earlier because you are done letting your life drift. It may look like leaving behind what once kept humiliating you. It may look like no longer begging for what should be given freely. It may look like becoming more disciplined with your body, your attention, your emotions, your standards. Not because you are angry, but because suffering has finally taught you the price of living carelessly. That is when pain begins serving your future instead of chaining you to your past. You do not honor your suffering by building your identity around it. You honor it by refusing to let it be meaningless, by extracting a principle from it, a standard, a lesson that changes the structure of your life. The old self wants to keep saying, "This is what happened to me." The new self begins asking, "What must I become because of it?" That shift changes everything. It moves you from emotional attachment to responsibility, from memory to movement, from wound to direction. Pain is part of life, but it must never become your permanent name. Let it sharpen your discipline. Let it clean your vision. Let it raise your standards until the life that once hurt you can no longer find the same version of you waiting there. That is how suffering stops being a prison and starts becoming a threshold. Not the story you live inside forever, but the fire you walked through to become someone stronger, quieter, and harder to break. Make going back impossible. There comes a point in rebuilding yourself where improvement is no longer enough. Reflection is no longer enough. Even discipline by itself is no longer enough if part of your mind is still keeping the old life available as an option. That is the final danger. Not failure in the obvious sense, but leaving a quiet door open inside yourself. A hidden permission. A private thought that says, if this gets too hard, I can always return. I can always go back to the old habits, the old mindset, the old excuses, the old environment, the old identity that asks less from me. And as long as that option still feels alive, the rebuild remains fragile. Because the old self does not need full control to survive. It only needs the possibility of return. This is why real transformation deepens the moment going back stops feeling available in your own mind. Not because you are forcing yourself into perfection, but because you have finally seen enough. Enough of what that old life costs. Enough of the emotional fatigue. Enough of the private shame. Enough of the repeated promises that led nowhere. Enough of watching your own potential get traded for comfort, distraction, and delay. At first, people think change happens when they become inspired. But often the deepest change happens when something in them becomes finished. Quietly. Completely. Not dramatic. Just done. The Stoics understood this inner finality. A person becomes powerful when their standards stop being temporary experiments and start becoming law. Not law imposed by fear, but law born from clarity. You know too much now to return lightly. You have seen what weakens you. You have seen what steals your peace. You have seen how the old patterns enter, how they feed, how they spread. And because you have seen it clearly, you can no longer pretend it is harmless. That is what makes going back harder. Truth. Once you truly see the cost of a lower life, it becomes more difficult to romanticize it again. But this final step also requires action. You cannot make going back impossible only through thought. You do it through removal, through structure, through consequence. You remove what keeps inviting the old you forward. You cut access to what repeatedly breaks your discipline. You stop keeping the same emotional escapes within reach. You stop leaving your schedule open to collapse. You stop protecting relationships, routines, and behaviors that keep trying to pull you into an earlier version of yourself. In other words, you do not just say you are done, you build your life in a way that proves it. That may mean changing your environment more seriously, changing your mornings, changing your nights, changing what you consume, who you speak to, what you tolerate when you are tired, lonely, bored, or emotionally hungry. Because the old self often returns through familiar doors, through one message, one room, one routine, one private indulgence, one thought repeated too many times. So the rebuild becomes real when you stop admiring your new standards and start defending them like something sacred. You stop acting like relapse into the old life is an innocent mistake. You begin treating it as contact with something you have already outgrown and no longer wish to host. This is not about fear, it is about respect. Respect for the work you have done, respect for the pain that taught you, respect for the self you are trying to become. There is a different quality in a person who has truly decided there is no way back. They move with less confusion, less internal bargaining, less emotional drama around every decision. They do not wake up each day asking whether they will betray themselves or not. That question has already been answered. The bridge is burned. The door is shut. The old life is not being visited in moments of weakness anymore because it is no longer being held in the mind as a comforting possibility. And strangely, that is when peace starts becoming stronger, because uncertainty drains enormous energy. The constant sense that you might return, might quit, might collapse, might undo your own progress, keeps the nervous system unstable. But when going back is no longer an option you entertain, your energy gathers. It stops leaking into fantasy, temptation, and negotiation. It becomes available for building, for living, for becoming. That is the final step. Not just wanting a new life, but ending your secret loyalty to the old one. Not just admiring discipline, but removing the exits that keep making indiscipline so easy. Not just saying you're different, but building in such a way that your former habits no longer have a place to land. That is when the rebuild becomes real. When your old life no longer has a way back in, not because you are superhuman, but because you finally became honest enough to stop keeping the door open. Destroying the old you is not an act of self-hatred. It is an act of self-respect. Some versions of you do not need more excuses, more patience, or one more emotional speech about why this time will be different. They need an ending, a real one. Because there comes a moment when continuing to protect the identity that is weakening you is no longer compassion, it is surrender. Rebuilding yourself alone does not mean rejecting the world. It means refusing to let the world be the thing that keeps holding you together. It means becoming someone whose direction is no longer dependent on praise, permission, comfort, noise, or rescue. Someone whose standards are strong enough to survive ordinary days. Someone whose discipline is quiet, private, and real. Someone who no longer needs to return to the old life just because the new one feels hard. And that is when change finally becomes trustworthy. Not when you feel different for a weekend. Not when you make one strong promise at night. But when your old ways stop finding a home in you. When your standards become clearer than your excuses. When your routines become stronger than your moods. When your silence becomes more honest than your old distractions. When going back no longer feels like relief, because you finally understand what it would cost. That is the rebuild, slow, private, unseen in the beginning, but once it becomes real, it changes everything, because now you are no longer trying to become someone new while protecting the life that keeps making you old. Now you're building from truth, and from there, the new self does not have to be forced. It begins to appear naturally in the way you think, the way you choose, the way you endure, and the way you live. That is when the old you is finally gone, not because you hated who you were, but because you respected your future too much to keep living beneath it.